The Lord Buddha, thus surrounded and venerated by these multitudes of many hundreds of thousands of living beings, sat upon a majestic lion throne and began to teach the Dharma. Dominating all the multitudes, just as Sumeru, the king of mountains, looms high over the oceans, the Lord Buddha shone, radiated, and glittered as he sat upon his magnificent lion throne. So we continue on with our excerpts from the Vimalakirti Nadesha Sutra, the Holy Scripture, according to Vimalakirti. This is the translation by Robert Thurman. And we're still at the opening, or still near the beginning of Chapter 1, entitled Purification of the Buddha Field. And we've been introduced to many of the beings. We've been told that the Buddha's at Vasily in a garden park there. That's where he and his disciples are, and that they are with many people, many bodhisattvas, but also many mythical beings as well, devas and kings and deva kings and so forth, Brahma and so forth, and many other types of being. And in the middle of all this, the Lord Buddha, surrounded by these multitudes, is sat upon a majestic lion throne. And of course the lion is the symbol of the Buddha. His teaching is known as the lion's roar. And so the lion, if you like, is his, perhaps symbol of his power. It's this, the lion in all cultures has that sense of regalness about it, as it does in our culture too. We call the lion the king of the animals, and here he is represented as the throne, and the Buddha sits on him. In other words, this is his basis, this is the foundation, this is his strength, if you like. And he begins to teach the Dharma. And as was said before when we first talked about the Mahayana Sutras in the introduction to this series of talks, the Mahayana Sutras are often very visionary, and this idea of the Buddha sitting on a majestic lion throne, and I think we should be viewing him not as a sort of person 6 foot tall, but as a giant of a being, and the throne itself would be a giant throne as well, around which all these multitudes are sat. And this visionary aspect of the Mahayana Sutras is very common, and it's very possible, scholars do believe, that in fact these may well be the product of visions that people were having as a result of their meditative practices. And so they're highly imaginative, and they're almost, in a sense, as we hear this sutra being read, it should spark quite naturally a sense of being there, a little bit like when we go to the cinema, and we very quickly, if the film captures our interest, we forget that we're sat in a cinema with friends or surrounded by people. We actually become part of the story that we're actually watching. And this is the same way too. Don't forget, all these sutras always start off, "Thus have I heard," which harks back to their oral tradition, their oral basis. Before they were actually written down, these stories were told. And so we should be visualizing this, or not visualizing, perhaps it's a little bit too intentional, but we should be allowing a picture to naturally arise of where this sutra is. And of course the interesting corollary to this is, of course, no one knows in fact what the Buddha looked like, because the Buddha himself, Shakyamuni Buddha, 2.5 millennia ago, forbade any images to be made of him. He wanted to avoid that personality cult around him, the person, the human being. And if we remember that at one such juncture in his teaching career, he was once asked, "Who are you?" And the man who asked it, the one who asked him, I think he was a Brahmin, asked him, he said, "Are you a god?" And the Buddha replied, "No, I'm not a god." He said, "Are you a semi-divine being?" "No, I am not." "Are you an angel then?" "No, I'm not an angel." "Well, what about a demon? Are you a demon king?" "No," he said, "I'm not a demon king." "Are you a human being?" "No, I'm not a human being." "Well, what then are you?" And the He replied, "I am the Buddha. I am awake." And it was really from sayings such as this one that the whole notion that the Buddha, the real Buddha, the real body of the Buddha, was not the flesh and blood body, that, so to speak, the real Buddha spoke through that one. And so it became much more, perhaps we could say, transcendental. And of course, all beings being endowed with the Buddha nature, this meant that it was possible still to hear the Buddha preaching. It was possible still to make contact with the Buddha, even though technically he had undergone the parinirvana, and the parinirvana means nirvana with nothing left. But we have to remember that the Mahayana taught that the Buddha's life itself was a skillful means for the benefit of all beings. So why would the Buddha leave us alone? Why would he abandon us if it's just a skillful means? It was just the appearance of the parinirvana and going beyond, or perhaps in one sense that the form had vanished, which it certainly had. The chariot had been taken apart and had now ceased to be. However, the true Buddha still was accessible. And this gave rise to, in the end, what was known as the Trikaya, or the teaching of the three bodies of the Buddha. You had the true body of the Buddha, which is the Dharmakaya, which is quiescent. You had the teaching body, which is known as the Sambhogakaya, and the Nimanakaya, or the transformation body. This is the appearance body of the Buddha, which was the one that existed 2,500 years ago. So no one actually really knows what he looked like. And of course the Buddha did this for a very specific reason. He wanted to avoid really what is a common error in religious practice and also in general practice, and that is idolatry. Idolatry being the imbuing of forms themselves with spiritual powers. And in fact, this idolatry is something that certainly appears in early religions. In the ancient Egyptian religion, they had the belief that certain statues actually became indwelling places of the deity itself. That story of the golden ball that we know, the monk sitting in his little meditation hut when the little golden ball appears in front of him, and how it leads him on a merry chase because it's so beautiful he must have it, and so he chases after it, and then it leads him up a tree, out along the slender branches at the top, and then suddenly pop, it vanishes, and the monk is left there clinging onto the tree, now terrified for fear of falling, and it's not until the following day that he's helped down. But what is that little golden ball? Well, the monk who told that story to Venerable Myokyo-ni, he said afterwards, he said, in a way, it serves that monk right, because he allowed his heart to escape from him. And this allowing the heart to escape from ourselves, of course, is what we do. Every time we chase after something, that is the process of fetishizing something. We fetishize an object. We may think of a fetish as either being some kind of sexual practice or some kind of magical practice. You see those fetishes that exist, for example, from Central Africa. They're quite startling images. And they have a sense of numinosity about them, and one could feel that somehow there's almost some kind of imbuing power in them. Well, that's exactly the same feeling we get every time we fall in love with something, or every time we become terrified of something. For someone who's arachnophobic, the spider, the form of the spider, has become the magical form, the form within which the feelings of horror or to which the feelings of horror are focused. And with desire, of course, it's the other way too. That's what that golden ball is. But actually it's our own heart that's escaped from us, and our practice is to realize that. Our practice is to realize that our heart does escape from us, and when it does that, to, as it were, reclaim it back. Because every time we project our heart onto something, or every time the heart gets projected onto something perhaps might be better, because it's not done intentionally at all. Of course, it's not subject to my conscious will. Every time that happens, then we don't see that object clearly. We don't see it as it is. And after all, the aim of the Buddha's teaching is to see things as they really are, not as our heart drapes and creates things through our wanting and not wanting in this case. And the Buddha was well aware of this condition in all of us, and that people naturally want to sort of hark back to a sort of more perfect time, the golden age, as it were. And after the Buddha's death, of course, the Buddha was just symbolized either by a Bodhi leaf or a footprint or a handprint, or sometimes the empty throne as well was a symbol of the Buddha. And these images are still existing now from India. And the story goes that there was once an arhat who had never met the Buddha, but he wished he had, and he was concerned because he was worried that it might that they were coming to a point now where there were so few people left who had actually met the Buddha that he would be forgotten. No one would know what he sounded like, what he looked like, and so on, and he thought this was a pity. And so he did his researches and found that there was one very elderly nun who had actually seen the Buddha. And so he sent a message on ahead and said to her, would it be possible to come and talk to you about the Buddha? And she sent a message back saying, yes, that was all right. And so an arrangement was made. And just before he arrived, the old woman, who lived in a rather remote part of the mountain, in a cave, and she had a sort of reed curtain, that or bamboo type curtain that hung in front of the cave, so that no one could see in, but it was well ventilated, the air could get through. And just inside the door she placed a large earthenware pot, which she filled up to the very brim with some oil. And then she sat back and waited. And the arhat, when he arrived, came strolling straight in. And the first thing he did was to kick over the pot and to spill the oil all over the place. Well, he was full of apologies, and she didn't say a word, just bent down and mopped up the whole mess. And once they were seated and she had presented him with some usual refreshments and so forth, she said, now, what is it that you want to know? And he explained that he understood that she had met the Buddha, and he very much wanted to know what he was like, how he spoke, what he looked like, and so on. And the old nun said, well, she said, of course, he was at the end of his teaching career when I met him. He was a very old man, and I was a very young girl. And she says, I will tell you something that not many people know. But on that particular day when I met him, for the first time, my parents were taking me. I was only a little girl, and I didn't really know what all this fuss was for. All I knew is that everybody was going to this place to hear somebody speak, and I wasn't really interested either. But what I was interested in was the fact that we were all dressed up in our finest clothes, and I had my finest clothes, and to really put the cream on the whole occasion, my mother gave to me a family heirloom, a very precious hair comb, and she placed it into my hair, and I was thrilled. I'd never dreamed that I would be allowed to actually wear it, and so I really felt that I was something special, like a princess. And so we went along, and there were huge crowds, and we were right at the back. And I remember that the Buddha was speaking. I have no idea what he said, but he was a long way away, and everybody was in rapt attention. And despite the fact that I looked so wonderful, no one was paying any attention to me. So in the end I got bored, and I went off to play on my own in the long grass. And after a while I put my hand up to my head and suddenly realized that the comb had dropped out. And in the long grass I could not find it. And I searched all over the place, but still I could not find it. And I was really now most upset and wondering what on earth what I was going to do, because this was a precious family heirloom after all. When suddenly, not far from me, I noticed in the grass a little pool of light had suddenly appeared, and I rushed over towards it, attracted by it, and there in the middle lay the family heirloom, the hair comb. And when I picked it up, I then noticed that the light was coming from a long way away, and I followed it back and saw that it emanated from the Buddha himself, from between his eyebrows. And suddenly I realized that this man, this Buddha, who had come to speak to all these people, had noticed the plight of a little girl far in the distance, and had been moved to help her. And I was so moved by his compassion that I went home, and from that day forth vowed that when I was old enough I would join him. And this is how I became a nun. And that is what I remember of the Buddha. And of course the Arhat was very pleased indeed. But she went on, there is something else I will tell you as well. When I was living in the Buddha's community, there were 5 Arhats who were always misbehaving. They were always getting themselves into one scrape or another, and the Buddha was forever admonishing them. But I have to tell you that in all the years that I knew them, and in all the years that the 5 of them used to come and visit me, and they did, not once did one of those Arhats knock over my bowl of oil. But you come rushing in here with your head full of ideas of who was the Buddha and what did he sound like, and not paying attention, you knock it all helter-skelter all over the place. And the Arhat felt duly admonished, particularly when she said, and you, being an Arhat as well, should be setting an example. That really put the nail in it. And so it is said that the Arhat humbly apologized, and it said that he then left, but that when he left very carefully indeed. So perhaps that gives us a sense really of what happens when we project, when we fetishize, when we are so full of what we want and our ideas, we fail to see things as they really are. And of course we all do this. We all act in haste and then live to regret it a little bit later on. And this is why the Buddha's way is really to try as much as possible to ensure that the heart does not escape from us. And to do that, of course, requires great strength. And this is why that lion and the lion throne, actually, which of course is the seat of our own Buddha nature, is so necessary. The lion, as has already been said, is a figure of royalty. It's a figure of nobility. And as has also been mentioned before, that term noble it is not something that we are born into. It's not because we're born into this family. It's actually something that we become through our practices, through our training, something that we become through living a certain way. And that way, laid out whether in the 6 parameters of the Mahayana or the Noble Eightfold Path, is an ennobling way, and why it's called the Noble Eightfold Path. So here we have the Lord Buddha, thus surrounded and venerated by these multitudes of many hundreds of thousands of living beings, sat upon a majestic lion throne and began to teach the Dharma, dominating all the multitudes, just as Sumeru, the king of mountains, looms high over the oceans. Sumeru is the king of mountains is, of course, Mount Sumeru, which is an adoption from Hinduism. Hinduism has Mount Sumeru as the world mountain. It's the very center of the world. The idea of a mountain or a pole star or something, or an axis or a tree, sometimes Yggdrasil in the Norse mythology, that there is some kind of foundation, something on which or around which everything else is built. And Sumeru is just that. It is said that, according to the cosmology, Buddhist cosmology, You have Mount Sumeru, you have the 6 realms that you find on the Wheel of Life. They're situated there with the 33 heavens at the top and the 16 hells at the bottom. And then and all the beings that live on there, of course. And then surrounding it are oceans, and surrounding the oceans are various mountain chains. And then there are the 4 great continents that lie north, south, west, and east. And this whole complex is a world system. And of course, our world system is one of many world systems, countless world systems. And this is what is samsara. But in the center is that Mount Sumeru. That's a powerful symbol of stability around which everything else goes. And the Buddha, of course, is being likened also to that stability. And of course, this is, well, it's interesting to ask us, where does our stability actually come from? We probably imagine, I don't know, what do we think that we can't live without, for example? What is the thing to which we truly cling to? Generally, it's something to do with I. And this is why I always live in fear of losing it. But the Buddha's strength actually is a different sort of strength. It's not something that can be clung to. It's something that's inherent. As Master Mumon said, the treasures of the house do not come in via the front gate. The treasures of the house being their heirlooms. And why is that? Because the house comes with the heirlooms. The house already has the heirlooms in it. And this is how the Buddha nature is also spoken of. The Buddha nature is inherent. Our problem is that we don't realize the inherent Buddha nature, and so we think we have no strength. And so we look outwards, trying to find a technique or trying to find something that I feel is necessary in order to give me strength. But the truth is, and this is the truth of the Buddha, the truth is that that strength is already in us. It's simply that we don't realize it, we don't have faith in it. And when it comes to it, also in our practice of giving myself into what at this moment is being done, and people often say, oh, but I just can't. Well, often when we look at that I just can't, really what it comes down to is that there's no faith in that just giving myself, because to give myself away is the same as coming into samadhi with the situation, whatever it may be. Right now, to give myself is to actually enter into samadhi. And that samadhi with the situation is the way things are, really and truthfully. And we of course are part of this situation. But somehow I don't like it. I want it to be faster or slower. All these thoughts, these are the thoughts of picking and choosing. And of course the third patriarch, Master Sozan, starts his great poem on faith in the heart. There's that word faith again. By saying the great way, the Mahayana, the great way is not difficult. It merely avoids picking and choosing. In the absence of that picking and choosing, then the heart quite naturally is at rest in the way things are. And that rest doesn't mean doing nothing either. It may be very active, but it's not split from it. It's not liking or loathing it. It's not judging it as wanted or not wanted, or good or bad, or any of the other pairs of opposites. It is firmly accepting of what it is, and if that acceptance, please, is not the same as becoming a doormat with the word welcome written on it, and simply, I walk down the street and there's an old lady being mugged and I just say, oh well, that's the way things really are, and walk on by. No. The heart naturally responds to the circumstances. They make a phone call to the dial 999, shout or something, assesses the situation and so forth. That's all part of the situation too. But usually in those situations I come in and then I'm obviously either frozen with fear or become hugely belligerent or whatever my reaction may be, and that complicates the situation. We cease to actually see the situation as it actually is, and so fail to respond to it. More often than not, it's not so much in those emergencies. Funnily enough, in those emergency situations, they're usually so startling that I'm startled out of myself. And actually there is something that takes over. And we read about this in the newspapers. People respond in crises in quite almost miraculous ways, in ways that they could not have imagined themselves reacting, or responding, perhaps, is better. And this not imagining, again, is something that comes back to I, because this is the whole point. I, with my rather blinkered view, see myself as this, or see myself as that, and this is what I do. And then suddenly some situation arises which calls for great strength or a great response. And if that feeling of I is not too strong, then remarkably that response can come. We may, thinking back of it, have experience of it in our own lives too. I do remember hearing an interview with the American mythologist Joseph Campbell, talked about where he lived in Hawaii, that there's a particular bridge that people who go to when they're going to commit suicide. And 2 police officers were in a patrol car patrolling the area, and they saw somebody on the parapet. And one of the officers leapt out of the car and just made it over to the man as he jumped and grabbed hold of him. But the weight of the man falling began to pull the police officer over, and he would have gone over if it hadn't been for his colleague who had managed to grab hold of the first officer. And so everyone was saved. And afterwards, when the newspapers interviewed the first officer and said, "Why didn't you let go of him? I mean, he was pulling you over." And the officer replied, "I couldn't have lived with myself if I had done that." And yet, looking at it, why? I mean, the police officer didn't know the man, but yet he had that powerful feeling that somehow he could not have let him go, even at threat of his own life. His own self-preservation instinct in that moment had been overcome. And it requires great strength for that to happen, and yet there it was. He probably didn't even know until that moment himself. He may well have been as perplexed as the newspaper interviewer was, who was asking that question, because in the ordinary circumstances I simply cannot imagine it. And this is why in the Mahayana sutras too we have these miracles. And we're going to be coming on to a miracle in the next talk, the first of many that appear in this sutra. These miraculous things that happen, and we think, oh, they're rather fanciful. And in that way, I again like to judge them and say, well, not to take them at face value and just read them purely as a literary device or symbolically or something. But actually, the real wonder, and this is why it's useful when we hear this sutra being spoken, to allow ourselves to really enter into it, into the wonder, because actually this is the teaching point, that there is something truly wonderful, truly amazing, if only we create sufficient space and allow it. It can actually be seen, and it can be trusted as well. There is such a thing as going beyond what I believe is possible. Well, we'll leave it there for now.